every morning with drive. Been on the grind, know I had to survive. We had to win. Started from the dirt and the rubble. I had to be the needle that was popping your bubble.
Hello and welcome into the Rookie Prospect Profile Series, a Zilla Fantasy Elite production. Today we're going to be looking at wide receiver Malik Nabers in the wide receiver machine learning models. Malik Nabers was drafted number 6 overall by the New York Giants, and they come into the league out of Louisiana State University, or LSU. Will Malik Nabers shine bright or falter in our fantasy forecast? Stick around to uncover the verdict from our cutting-edge machine learning models, which does 1,000 simulations for each season of the prospect's first 4 years in the NFL. Looking at some of the physical traits, we see that Malik Nabers comes in at exactly 6 foot, exactly 200 pounds, and ran a 4.40 in the 40-yard dash and a 42-inch vertical, so we can see they are a very, very explosive player. So let's now dive into Malik Nabers' first year predictions. Looking at his predictions here, we can see he comes in with a minimum of 3.30 fantasy points per game. Again, this is PPR setting. That's actually ranked number 6 in the class. So he's got the 6th best minimum prediction. The 10th percentile at 8.16 fantasy points per game is ranked 2nd overall. 25th percentile at 9.86 fantasy points per game, ranked number 2 overall. The mean and median at 11.52 and 11.67 respectively, both number 2 in the class. Getting into that 75th percentile, he's at 13.35 fantasy points per game. That's number 1 in the class. Getting towards that ceiling, we can see he cranks up closer to the number 1, number 2 in the class here. 90th percentile, 14.65 fantasy points per game. That again is number 1 in the class. And then he maxes out at 17.31, which is number 2 in the class for maximum predictions. Standard deviation came in at 2.47, which was the 39th lowest standard deviation. You want a lower standard deviation. His was 39 out of 40 total wide receivers. You might be asking, why is it so high? Well, it's because his predictions were a lot higher. His CV was actually 21.4%, which was the 4th best in the class. And you can think of CV basically as a confidence variable, or really it stands for coefficient of variation. So how spread out was the data set? He's coming in number 4 overall in the class in terms of that. So it's basically saying it's the 4th most confident in Malik Nabers' output here in the class. For those who don't know the stats, CV is really your standard deviation or your mean, your average, so your mean. That 11.52 divided by your standard deviation, which is 2.47. So the higher the mean and the lower that standard deviation, the better that CV value is going to get. So the better the CV value, the lower it is. We're looking at Malik Nabers, number 4 overall. So what do these numbers mean for him in fantasy? What do other wide receivers do in their first season? Looking at that 11.5 to 11.67 at the median range, we see guys like Allen Robinson, Steph Diggs, Sterling Shepard, right, all at 11.5 or 11.50. DK Metcalf, 11.6. Christian Watson, 11.72. Very similar to what we saw from the Marvin Harrison profile in his median range of outcomes. And then getting into the higher range there at the 17.31. People right there, that's like 4th best in the class if he does hit that maximum ceiling. 4th best overall. We have Odell Beckham. He had 24.6 in his rookie season. Jamar Chase at 17.92, Puka Nacua at 17.56, and then, should Malik Nabers hit his maximum, he'd fall right above Justin Jefferson at 17.14, Michael Thomas rookie season 17, Mike Evans 16.3. So again, very similar to the Marvin Harrison profile, getting the same kind of players here in the profile in case he hits a ceiling. So now let's get into year number 2 for Malik Nabers. We can see that he comes in with a minimum prediction of 8.09 fantasy points per game, which is number 1 in the class. He's actually number 1 across the board for year 2. So it's saying, hey, out of all the prospects that were coming out the 40 that we're looking at, he's going to be number 1 in year 2 across the board for all of these values. So 10th percentile, 11.79%, 25th percentile, 11.79 fantasy points per game. 25th percentile, 13.39 fantasy points per game. The mean and median, 14.95 and 15.17 respectively. 75th and 90th percentile, 16.75 and 17.88 fantasy points per game. And then the number 1 ceiling in the class in year 2 is Malik Nabers at 20.50 fantasy points per game. Standard deviation we see at 12.36, which is the 37th best standard deviation. Again, that's because his predictions are so high. And then the CV, 15.8%. So that's number 1 in the class in terms of CV. It says, hey, Malik Nabers, year 2, he's going to be really good. And I'm really confident in this result. It is the number 1 best CV in the class. So what do those year 2 outputs look like for Malik Nabers in the 15 fantasy points per game range for his mean and median, sorting by the largest to the smallest fantasy points per game in year 2 for all prospects in the database. Getting around that 15 range, we have Calvin Ridley, Allen Hurns, Devonta Smith. They're all right at 14.98 or 15 flat. Terry McLaurin was at 14.92. We again see Stephon Diggs, 14.9, a little bit higher than that. Michael Gallup, 15.2, Jalen Waddle, 15.25, DJ Moore, 15.4 in his second season. So that's what it looks like for his fantasy output in year 2 on the median range. If we get into that maximum range of 20.5, we start getting way up there. That would be number 2 overall out of all year 2 fantasy players. Odell Beckham at 21.3 is number 1. Jamar Chase at number 2 is at 20.2 fantasy points per game. So it's really predicting something very close to that. The 20.5 is basically saying you could have the second highest ceiling ever. Justin Jefferson, 19.44. Allen Robinson, 19. Juju Smith-Schuster, 18.4. AJ Brown, 17.68. Just to kind of give you the top 7 players there of all time in their second season in the league. All right, getting into the year 3 output for Malik Nabers, we see him come in with a minimum prediction of 5.45 fantasy points per game, second best minimum prediction in the class in year 3. 10th percentile, 25th percentile, 10.25 and 12.34 fantasy points per game respectively, both number 4 in the class. The mean and median, 13.71 and 14.04 fantasy points per game. Again, number 4 in the class on both of those. The 75th and 90th percentiles, 15.42 and 16.51 fantasy points per game. Both of those also number 4 in the class. And then looking at the ceiling, his maximum output, 20.02 fantasy points per game, number 3 in the class. Standard deviation, 2.44, 33rd best in the class. And then that confidence ranking, CV at 17.8% is the 3rd best in the class. So taking that into consideration, year 2, he was the number 1 prospect across the board. We're looking at year 3, maybe takes a little step down compared to some of his counterparts in the draft. He's looking at, 3rd, 4th for a lot of these, 3rd best ceiling, 4th across the board for some of those, but his low end is the 2nd best in the class. And what do those fantasy output mean for year 3? That mean and median around 13.7 and 14.04. If we again look at all of the year 3 players throughout history and sort from largest to smallest fantasy output, and then trying to see where the upper 13s and 14s are for a range in year 3, we see Michael Pittman 13.53, Jerry Jeudy 13.61. AJ Brown again, 13.92. DJ Moore again, 14.1. Marquise Brown, 14.14. And then Jalen Waddle again at 14.19. Steph Diggs, 14.2. So we see a lot of Steph Diggs in the profile throughout the first 3 years in terms of how he's going to produce. Getting into that higher range for Malik Nabers at 20.02. We're looking at Keenan Allen at 20.2, Tyreek Hill 20.5, Michael Thomas 19.7. And again, those guys are sitting down there in the top 8, 9 players of all time in year 3. So that's kind of what they're expecting from Malik Nabers' ceiling in year 3. All right, now rounding out his career, let's get into the 4th year for Malik Nabers. 4th year in the league, what's he look like? Well, his minimum prediction is 2.29, which has dropped him down to the 7th best minimum score on the year 4 outputs. Looking at the 10th percentile and 25th percentile, 7.18 and 9.56 fantasy points per game, respectively. Those are good for rank number 5 and number 3, respectively. The mean and median, 11.66 and 11.95 fantasy points per game. Those are both 3rd in the class, so the 3rd best mean and median scores for the entire class. The 75th and 90th percentiles at 14.04 and 15.59. Those also good for 3rd best in the class. And then the maximum output in year 4, 20.78. That is 3rd best in the class as well. And kind of getting into the standard deviation, 3.21. So we see those kind of rise up. That is the worst standard deviation in the class, but his CV still at 27.5% is 7th best in the class. And what does that fantasy output in year 4 mean? That mean and median around 11.5 to 12 fantasy points per game. Again, if we do the exercise where we sort all of the fantasy points per game scores from all year 4 players and start looking at that particular range, 11.5 to 12 fantasy points per game, we get names similar to T. Higgins in his 4th year was at 11.47, so that was last year. Russell Gage, 11.64. Mecole Hardman, 11.73. Adam Humphries, 11.8. Will Fuller, 12.2. Christian Kirk, 12.21. And then you got a few names that might surprise you in that range. Keenan Allen was at 12.3. DeAndre Hopkins at 12.3 in their 4th year. So we see them probably take a dip from where they were in some of their other years, but that's what the model's taking into consideration when it's doing these. Some of these players, don't always score 20 fantasy points per game. Guys like DeAndre Hopkins and Keenan Allen, who are super good, sometimes, they're going to have an off year, and that's kind of what it's expecting based off of what it saw for the midterm there, or for those median scores. That 20.78 maximum, that's getting into the range of like number 3 ever in the history if he hits a ceiling. So CeeDee Lamb last year, 23.72 fantasy points per game is the best ever in year 4. Michael Thomas hit 23.4 in his 4th year. And then we drop all the way down to Justin Jefferson at number 3 is at 20.22 fantasy points per game. Odell Beckham, 18.5. AJ Brown, 17.62. Stephon Diggs, 17.6. So we see a big stark drop off. Is probably why we see a little bit of a dip across the board for most prospects when they get into year 4, is we see a little bit of a decline. Only a couple people above 20, and then the rest of them, in 18, 17, 16 range. Even top 10, Devontae Adams, he's at 15.9 fantasy points per game in his 4th year. So not a lot of people going nuclear in their 4th year for whatever reason, but that's what the model takes into consideration and says, hey, based off of his history in the NFL, this is what I'm expecting this player to do. And that's really going to do it for this particular profile, Malik Nabers. Hopefully these machine learning models can help you get a little bit of additional confidence when you're going into your rookie drafts and the analysis that you're doing for each of these incoming rookies. Really proud to have you with us. Thanks for watching today's rookie prospect profile on Malik Nabers, presented by Zilla Fantasy Elite. Thanks for tuning in. Hit that subscribe button. Have a good one. Bye.